When I finally turned off the cracked asphalt road and onto the gravel path that led to my family's old cabin, the sound of crunching stones under my tires felt like an echo of a life I'd left behind. 3 years had passed since I last saw this place. 3 years filled with hospital corridors, lawyers, city noise, and the kind of exhaustion that eats at your soul. When my father passed away, I couldn't bring myself to come back. The cabin had been our project, our retreat, the one place where we built something together that didn't depend on anyone else. But after losing him, it hurt too much to even think about it. So I left it untouched, trusting that the land and the trees would stand watch in my absence. As I drove through the familiar bend, I felt my pulse quicken. I'd imagined this moment dozens of times, me stepping out, breathing in the mountain air, maybe finding a few branches to clear and some dust to sweep. What I didn't imagine was a large, freshly planted no trespassing, private property, HOA enforcement sign hammered right into the ground beside my old mailbox. I frowned, thinking it was a prank or maybe a warning for someone else's property nearby. But then I saw the same sign scattered along my tree line, bright red letters against pale birch trunks, each nailed with care. My stomach dropped. The wooden post marking my driveway had been replaced with a small metal sign reading HOA Lot 43. I killed the engine and sat in silence, trying to process what I was looking at. The place I grew up, the cabin I inherited, was now marked as someone else's territory. When I stepped out of the car, I noticed other changes. The gravel drive was widened as if used frequently. The old fence I'd built with my dad had been torn down. Even the welcome sign, my father's hand-carved Carter Cabin 1989, was missing. Instead, there was a laminated HOA map in its place showing outlined lots, road names, and something called Silver Pine Estates. My land was listed right in the middle of it. I walked up the slope to where the porch should have been, half expecting to see the cabin in ruins. But there it stood, still solid, though someone had painted over the front door and changed the locks. The windows were covered from the inside with thick paper. It looked lived in or guarded. I called out, half hoping no one would answer, but a woman appeared from behind a neighboring house. She wore a navy blue jacket embroidered with the letters Silver Pine HOA. Her short, gray hair framed a tight expression that told me this wasn't a friendly welcome. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone sharp, rehearsed. "Yeah," I said slowly. "I own this cabin. The Carter property. Been in my family since '89. Her eyes narrowed like I'd just told a bad joke. "I think you're mistaken. This land is part of the Silver Pine community now. If you're trespassing, I'll have to call security." I laughed in disbelief. "Security? Ma'am, this is my land. I've got the deed, the title, everything. It's been ours since before this community even existed." She crossed her arms. "Then you'll need to speak with the HOA board. We acquired these lots legally after they were deemed abandoned. You can't just show up here after years and claim it's yours." Her words hit like a slap. Abandoned. I'd never sold, never rented, never signed anything. I'd been paying taxes every single year, quietly, automatically, through my father's trust account. But now, this stranger was telling me I didn't belong. "Who's the president of this HOA?" I asked, my voice tightening. "That would be me," she said proudly, straightening her badge. "And you're trespassing." I took a slow breath. "What's your name?" "Margaret Holt," she said, "but everyone calls me Peggy." She looked down at her clipboard and made a note as if documenting my existence. "I'll need to ask you to leave. This is private property." I stared at the cabin, at the chipped window frames, at the place my father taught me to fish and fix things and be patient. "I'm not going anywhere," I said quietly. "Not until I figure out what's going on." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Then I'll have to involve the sheriff." She turned and walked back down the hill, phone already in hand. I stood there for a long moment, my mind spinning. What kind of twisted thing had happened here while I was gone? Had someone forged records? How could an HOA just take someone's land? I opened my truck, grabbed the metal lockbox I kept for important papers, and sat on the tailgate. Inside, neatly sealed in a folder, were the documents my father left me property deed, survey maps, tax receipts. Every line of it was clear. Carter family, lot 12B, 15 acres, unincorporated county land. No HOA, no development zone. 15 minutes later, a sheriff's cruiser pulled up beside my truck. The deputy stepped out, looking tired but professional. "Afternoon, sir. Got a report of trespassing?" he asked. Peggy was right behind him, arms folded like she'd already won. "Yeah," I said, handing him the folder. "I think there's been a mistake. This is my property." The deputy flipped through the papers, raising his eyebrows. "These look legit. You've got tax payments up to last year. So you've owned this continuously?" "Yes, sir," I said, "since before there was ever a Silver Pine anything." He nodded, then glanced at Peggy. "Ma'am, you got anything showing this is part of your HOA?" She frowned, pulling out a few photocopies from her folder. This area was annexed 3 years ago after multiple lots were listed as abandoned under county code. We followed all procedures. The deputy sighed, handing back both folders. "Looks like a civil matter to me. You two need to take this to the county clerk or court." But for now, he looked at Peggy. This man isn't trespassing on his own property. Peggy's face flushed red. "You're making a mistake," she snapped. "You can't just let people walk in like they own the place." "Ma'am," the deputy said calmly, "sometimes they do." As she stormed off, I looked up at the cabin again, my father's memory flickering like sunlight through the pines. I'd come back to find peace, but instead, I'd walked into a war I didn't start. And something told me Peggy Holt wasn't the type to let things go quietly. The next morning, I woke up in my truck parked beside the cabin, the windows fogged from the cold mountain air. I hadn't meant to fall asleep there, but after the chaos of yesterday, Peggy's threats, the sheriff's visit, the realization that my father's land was tangled up in some HOA nightmare, I couldn't bring myself to leave. I spent half the night rereading every document I had, shining my flashlight on the deed and tracing my father's handwriting where he'd signed in 1989. Everything was legitimate. The land was ours, and no amount of laminated maps or smug HOA officials could change that. Still, I knew things like this didn't just happen. Someone had filed something, forged something, or maybe manipulated the system while I was gone. As the sun rose, I headed into town. The county seat was only about 20 miles away, a small courthouse surrounded by old brick shops and a diner that hadn't changed since the 1970s. Inside, the clerk's office smelled of coffee and dust. A young woman named Teresa greeted me at the counter. I explained my situation, laying out the deed, my tax receipts, and a recent photograph of the cabin. She looked through everything, her expression tightening the further she read. "You're not the first one," she said finally. "We've had a few complaints from landowners around Silver Pine Estates. That HOA's been aggressive about absorbing properties. Let me pull up the parcel record." Her fingers flew across the keyboard, the screen reflecting in her glasses. "Okay, here's the issue. About 2 years ago, a company called Silver Pine Development LLC submitted an annexation request for several adjacent lots, claiming they were abandoned. The county approved it. Under the assumption the owners couldn't be reached, I leaned closer. But I've been paying taxes every year. How could they claim it was abandoned?" Teresa clicked again. "They used an old address. Your father's, I assume?" I nodded slowly. After he passed, mail forwarding probably expired. They sent certified letters there, got no response, and boom, abandonment declared. Legally, they shouldn't have been able to annex it without a title search, but it looks like the developer filed a quitclaim deed through a shell buyer. That's how they got it under the HOA. I exhaled hard, gripping the edge of the counter. So, someone forged ownership paperwork. Teresa nodded grimly. "Looks that way. You'll need a real estate attorney to file a quiet title action. It's not quick, but it'll clear your name on record and remove the HOA's claim. On my way out," she lowered her voice. "Just a warning, Peggy Holt used to work for the county assessor's office. She knows exactly how to manipulate the process." That piece of information hit me like a brick. It made sense. She wasn't just some overzealous HOA president, she was an insider who knew how to twist bureaucracy in her favor. I drove straight to the diner across the street, ordered coffee, and started making calls. By noon, I found a local attorney named Daniel Reeves who specialized in land disputes. When I explained what happened, he didn't sound surprised. "Ah, Silver Pine," he said dryly. "They've been trying to expand for years. You're not the first person they've steamrolled. But if your paperwork's clean, you're in the right." I met him at his small office later that day. He looked over my documents for nearly an hour before leaning back in his chair. "You've got a solid case," he said finally. "They filed fraudulent documents, plain and simple. We'll file a petition to void the annexation and reinstate your ownership. It'll take months, maybe longer, but you'll win." That should have given me comfort, but it didn't, because while the legal system crawled forward, Peggy would still act like she owned the place. And I wasn't about to let her tear apart my home. When I returned to the cabin that evening, I found 2 new signs at the edge of my driveway. "Trespassers will be prosecuted. HOA security patrol active." My truck had a warning notice taped to the windshield: "Unauthorized vehicle on private property." It was signed by Peggy herself. She'd even gone so far as to nail a community maintenance fee due envelope to my cabin door. Inside was an invoice for $1,375, annual dues and back assessments. I laughed out loud. It was so ridiculous it almost felt like a prank. But it wasn't funny. It was her way of saying, "You may have the law, but I have control." That night, I decided to make the place livable again. I forced open one of the boarded windows, climbed inside, and found the interior mostly untouched. Dust covered everything, but my father's old tools were still there, the stone fireplace intact. I lit a small fire and sat in the creaking armchair, letting the warmth thaw the tension from my bones. Outside, I could see headlights sweeping slowly along the gravel road. An SUV marked Silver Pine Security. They slowed down when they saw the smoke from my chimney. I could almost feel Peggy's eyes behind that tinted glass. The next morning, Daniel called. "We filed the initial petition," he said, "but brace yourself. The HOA will fight back hard. They'll probably send cease and desist letters, maybe even try to intimidate you. Don't respond directly. Let me handle it." He wasn't wrong. Within 48 hours, I got a certified letter demanding I vacate the property to prevent further violation of community covenants. It was laughable. Those covenants didn't even apply to my land, but the language was designed to scare. They claimed I was creating a safety hazard and disrupting neighborhood harmony. A few days later, I drove into the Silver Pine subdivision to see what kind of community I was supposedly part of. It was a maze of freshly built houses, all with identical beige siding and manicured lawns. Kids' bikes were lined up in perfect rows, and the air smelled faintly of chlorine from the community pool. When I pulled over to take photos for evidence, a man in a golf cart stopped beside me. "You lost?" he asked. "No," I said, "just checking the area. My property borders this side." He frowned. "You mean the old cabin lot?" Peggy said the guy who owned that passed away years ago. She said it's under HOA maintenance now. My jaw clenched. Well, Peggy was wrong. The man shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing he'd walked into something deeper than gossip. "Look, I don't want trouble, but she's been telling people you're squatting. Said you're dangerous." I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her strategy. Discredit first, control second, silence last. That night, I sat on the porch steps, listening to the crickets and the distant hum of the highway. The mountains looked peaceful, indifferent to all this human nonsense. My father used to say, "Land remembers who belongs to it." I'd never understood that until now. This wasn't just about property or pride, it was about legacy, about not letting someone rewrite the story my family built here. As I watched the stars rise above the dark pines, I made myself a promise. I wasn't leaving. Not for Peggy, not for the HOA, not for anyone. They could throw every trick in the book at me, but I'd fight them until the last nail in that cabin's frame. Because this land wasn't abandoned. I was home. The harassment started subtly, Almost like a game, Peggy thought. She could win through persistence. At first, it was little things, new private property signs appearing overnight, bright orange stakes marking supposed property boundaries that cut right across my driveway, and HOA newsletters mysteriously left on my porch with highlighted sections about unauthorized occupants. I ignored them at first, figuring they were just intimidation tactics. But within a week, it escalated. One morning, I woke up to the sound of a chainsaw. The low buzz came from down by the creek, the natural border between my land and the silver pine lots. I rushed out and found two men in neon vests cutting down trees on my side of the water. "Hey!" I shouted, running down the slope. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" One of them looked up, startled, but the other didn't stop. "HOA, maintenance," the first man said flatly. "We're clearing underbrush to prevent fire hazards." I stepped in front of the chainsaw path. "This is my land. You're trespassing." The man hesitated. "You'll have to talk to Ms. Holt," he muttered. "She gave us authorization." "Then you can tell Ms. Holt she's about to get a trespassing report filed against her." The men left, but the damage was done. 5 young oaks gone, their stumps raw and bleeding sap into the dirt. It was personal now. I drove straight to the sheriff's office and filed an official complaint. The deputy recognized me from before and sighed when I walked in. "You again," he said, not unkindly. "Let me guess, Silver Pine?" "You got it," I said, handing over photos of the cut trees. "They sent contractors onto my land." He nodded, filling out the report. "I'll send a warning. But you need to understand, HOAs like that, they've got lawyers for breakfast. Just keep documenting everything. Don't lose your cool." Easier said than done. When I returned to the cabin, there were fresh tire tracks across the driveway and a small camera nailed to a tree facing my front porch. It was labeled Community Watch. I yanked it down and tossed it into the bed of my truck, shaking my head in disbelief. Peggy wasn't just stubborn, she was obsessed. That night, I sat on the porch again trying to think. The woods were quiet except for the occasional crack of twigs and the rustle of animals. Around midnight, headlights flickered through the trees. A black SUV crept slowly up the road, stopped just short of my cabin, then reversed back down the hill. I recognized it immediately, Silver Pine Security. They were patrolling me like I was a criminal. The next morning, I decided to confront Peggy directly. Enough was enough. I drove to the HOA office, a spotless, beige building at the edge of the development with perfectly trimmed hedges and a flagpole out front. Inside, the air smelled of air freshener and self-importance. Peggy sat behind a long counter, tapping away on her computer. Her smile was tight when she saw me. "Mr. Carter," she said, as if I were an expected nuisance. "Back again, I see." "Cut the games, Peggy," I said, placing a folder on her desk. "You and I both know this land isn't yours, and no amount of fake paperwork will make it otherwise. You've trespassed, harassed, and spread lies. It stops now." She tilted her head slightly, feigning innocence. "You're mistaken. You're residing on property under the Silver Pine HOA's jurisdiction. Until a court says otherwise, you're bound by our regulations." "Then you'll be hearing from my attorney again," I said. Her smile never faltered. "Oh, I'm sure we will. But you should understand, Mr. Carter, your behavior is making a lot of residents uncomfortable. They don't like seeing an armed man living in a boarded-up cabin. It's unsettling." I stared at her. "Armed? What are you talking about?" She folded her hands primly. "We received reports that you've been brandishing a weapon around the property. Multiple residents saw it." It was a lie. I hadn't fired or even shown my father's old hunting rifle since I got there. It was locked away in a case inside the cabin. "That's slander," I said quietly. Peggy leaned forward. "No, that's community concern. And if it continues, we'll be forced to file for a restraining order. Maybe even get a court injunction to remove you from the premises for everyone's safety." For a moment, all I could do was stare at her. She'd planned this from the start. The fake annexation, the trespassing, the harassment, it was all part of her playbook. Force me to react, then paint me as the threat. I didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me angry. I picked up my folder and turned to leave. I said, pausing at the door, my dad used to say, some people can't stand the idea of losing control. They'll burn down everything just to keep it. That's you, Peggy. And you're about to learn what happens when you pick a fight with someone who's got nothing left to lose. Her voice followed me as I walked out. We'll see about that, Mr. Carter. Over the next week, the rumors spread. People from Silver Pine started driving past my property, slowing down to take photos. Someone posted my name on the community Facebook group, claiming I was a violent squatter threatening neighbors. My mailbox filled with anonymous letters. Leave before it gets ugly. You don't belong here. The HOA protects its own. Daniel, my attorney, told me to stay calm. They're baiting you, he said. If you react, they'll use it against you. Let the paperwork speak. But the paperwork didn't stop the trucks that parked near my property line every few nights, or the mysterious nails I found scattered across my driveway one morning. It didn't stop the county Inspector Peggy sent, claiming my dwelling was unfit for habitation. I showed the man my documents, my repairs, everything, but he still wrote up a warning pending verification. I started setting up my own cameras, hidden in the trees, recording every vehicle that came and went. I logged times, dates, license plates. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd play smart. One night, just after midnight, I heard footsteps outside the cabin. Not the cautious steps of wildlife, heavy boots crunching through the gravel. I grabbed my flashlight, flicked it on, and opened the door. The light caught a figure in a dark hoodie sprinting toward the woods. Something metallic clinked to the ground as they ran. I rushed forward and found a gas can half hidden in the brush. My blood ran cold. I called the sheriff immediately. When they arrived, they took the camera footage, and my statement. The deputy promised to increase patrols, but I could see in his eyes he didn't think much would come of it. Could be kids, he said. Could be intimidation. Either way, don't stay out here alone too long. But I wasn't leaving. Every move Peggy made only strengthened my resolve. She wanted me out so badly that she was willing to risk arson. That told me one thing: there was something about my land she didn't want me to discover. Later that week, while walking the property's back line, I noticed fresh survey markers deep in the woods, bright pink flags tied to stakes leading toward a clearing near the ridge. When I followed them, I found construction materials, pipes, rebar, and pallets of cement, all hidden under tarps. It wasn't HOA maintenance. It was a development project. My land wasn't just in her way. It was part of her plan. As I stood there among the stacks of supplies, realization hit me like lightning. This wasn't about neighborhood aesthetics or community rules. Peggy and her partners had been quietly expanding Silver Pine, building new homes on land they didn't yet own, and mine was the final piece of their puzzle. They weren't going to stop. Not until I was gone. The discovery of the construction materials on my land changed everything. Up until that moment, I thought Peggy's campaign against me was personal, about control, about ego, about her obsession with power. But now I saw the truth. This was about money. Big money. Silver Pine wasn't just an overzealous HOA, it was a front for something much larger. Someone was trying to build beyond their legal boundary, and my 15 acres stood in their way. If they could drive me out through intimidation, lies, and forged paperwork, they could build whatever they wanted here. A new phase of homes, maybe even a private resort section, and Peggy Holt was the gatekeeper, making sure nothing interfered with their quiet land grab. That night, I sat by the fire inside the cabin, staring at the survey markers I'd collected. The bright pink ribbons fluttered slightly in the draft, reminders that someone had been trespassing on my land repeatedly, planning something under the radar. I took photos of everything: the stakes, the materials, even the tire tracks leading up from the HOA side. Then I sent them to Daniel, my attorney, with a message: "We've got a motive." By morning, he called me back, his voice sounding sharper, more energized. "That's huge," he said. "If they're conducting unauthorized development on your property, that's criminal, not just civil. We'll need proof, permits, contractors, blueprints, anything linking them to the work." So I decided to dig deeper, literally and figuratively. I drove to the county planning office, pretending to be a curious buyer interested in the Silver Pine expansion. The clerk, an older man with glasses perched low on his nose, pulled up the public records. Silver Pine Development LLC, I said casually. They're expanding again, right? He nodded. Phase 4, yes. Filed under Holt Realty Associates. I froze. Holt, yeah, he said, scrolling. Listed as managing partner. They've got preliminary permits for road work and utilities. It's supposed to stretch north into the forest. North. I repeated quietly, tracing the map he had displayed. My cabin sat directly on that northern line. Can I get a copy of those permits? He printed them without hesitation, handing me a small stack of papers. And there it was in black and white, Phase 4, Silver Pine Estates, 24 residential lots, projected completion date pending land acquisition. They'd already mapped my land into their plans before they even owned it. My stomach turned. They weren't just hoping I'd leave, they were counting on it. I spent the rest of the day gathering more evidence. I photographed the lot markers, measured GPS coordinates, and matched them to the permit blueprints. Every detail confirmed the same thing. Peggy and her partners were illegally developing my property. That evening, when I got back to the cabin, I found another letter taped to my door. It was from the HOA's legal counsel, a formal notice demanding that I vacate pending an emergency board meeting. It accused me of obstructing scheduled maintenance and damaging community property. They were trying to flip the narrative, making me look like the aggressor. I called Daniel again. They're doubling down, I said. Let them, he replied. They're digging their own grave. I'll draft a counterclaim for fraud, harassment, and illegal annexation. But we'll need to bring in a surveyor, someone independent, to document everything. The next morning, I met with a licensed surveyor named Mike Andrews. He was an older guy, quiet and methodical, with a GPS scanner and a drone that buzzed softly as it mapped the property. You're right, he said after a few hours. These flags are about 120 feet into your land. No question. And that trench they've started over there? That's not drainage. That's a foundation line. He handed me the data, complete with timestamps and coordinates. If you ever go to court, this'll hold up. Later that afternoon, as Mike packed his truck, a white SUV pulled up at the edge of my driveway. Peggy stepped out, sunglasses perched on her head, clipboard in hand. You're trespassing again, she said coldly, her tone so rehearsed it was almost robotic. I folded my arms. Funny. That's exactly what your contractors are doing. She smiled faintly. We're conducting community development under approved permits. I held up the documents from the county office. These? The ones showing your company planning homes on land you don't own. For the first time, her expression cracked. A flicker of surprise crossed her face before she recovered. Those are preliminary documents, she said, curtly. They don't mean construction has begun. Tell that to the chainsaw crew and the concrete pallets hidden on my property, I said. Or maybe I should let the sheriff and the local paper tell the story for you. She didn't respond, just stared at me with that thin-lipped anger that said she was recalculating. You have no idea what you're getting into, she said finally. Oh, I think I do, I replied. You stole land, lied to the county, and now you're trying to bully me out of it. That's what I'm getting into. She turned abruptly and walked back to her SUV. Before leaving, she rolled down her window and said, You should be careful, Mr. Carter. People who make enemies in this community don't last long. The threat hung in the air even after she drove off. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made me jump, the rustle of leaves, the creak of the porch boards, the faint hum of engines down the road. Around midnight, I noticed movement through the trees again, flashlights this time near the creek. I quietly grabbed my camera, snuck to the back window, and zoomed in. 2 men were walking the property line, marking new spots with tape. One of them I recognized. It was the same guy who'd been cutting trees earlier that week. I filmed them for several minutes as they drove steel stakes into the ground. The next morning, I brought the footage straight to Daniel. He watched in silence, then leaned back in his chair. This is gold, he said. They're caught red-handed doing unpermitted work. I'm filing for an injunction today. Once it's granted, any construction or interference will be legally prohibited until the case is resolved. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of relief. Maybe the nightmare was finally shifting in my favor. But that relief didn't last long. By evening, I noticed something strange: county trucks arriving at the entrance to the Silver Pine subdivision, unloading more equipment. When I asked one of the workers what was going on, he said, "Utility expansion, water lines for the new phase. Should be running right through those woods." My woods. It was obvious what Peggy was doing. She was racing the clock, trying to finish the infrastructure before the injunction could take effect. Once utilities were installed, tearing them out would be nearly impossible. I called Daniel again. "They're moving fast. Too fast." "Hold tight," he said. "I'll have the paperwork to the judge by morning. You just keep recording everything. Every truck, every worker, every mark on your property." So that's what I did. I spent the next 2 days documenting every illegal move they made. I even climbed the ridge to get aerial photos of the trenches cutting across my land. It was exhausting, infuriating, and surreal watching strangers treat my home like it was a construction zone. But I wasn't just collecting evidence. I was preparing for something bigger. I started reaching out to local journalists, environmental groups, and even a small YouTube channel that covered land disputes. The story was too good for them to ignore. HOA builds over private landowners' property without consent. I knew Peggy would explode when she found out, but I didn't care anymore. I was done hiding in the shadows while she tried to erase my name from my own family's history. For the first time since I'd returned, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like someone about to strike back. The following week was a blur of motion, paperwork, and tension so thick it felt like the mountain air itself had turned solid. The injunction Daniel filed was accepted by the county court, and a temporary order was issued to halt all development activity within the disputed boundary of my property until ownership was verified. It was a small victory, but it was the first real sign that the truth was finally being acknowledged by someone other than me. When I arrived back at the cabin that morning, the construction equipment was still there, but the workers were gone. A laminated notice had been taped to a tree near the creek: "Stop work order, County Enforcement Division." I couldn't help but smile for the first time in weeks. The land was quiet again, the way it should have been all along. But I knew Peggy wouldn't let this go. She'd invested too much into Silver Pine's expansion to watch it crumble now. I just didn't realize how desperate she'd become until that night. Around 9 p.m., I was sitting inside, reviewing the growing stack of evidence, when I heard tires screeching on the gravel road. Headlights cut across the trees, and a car door slammed shut. Then came the sound of footsteps, fast, angry. Before I could even stand, there was pounding on the door. "Mr. Carter, open up right now." I recognized the voice instantly. "Peggy." I opened the door just enough to see her standing there in her trademark navy jacket, her hair wind-blown and her face twisted with fury. She waved a folder in her hand. "You think you're clever? You think some half-baked injunction is going to stop progress?" I stayed calm. "It's not about stopping progress. It's about stopping theft. You're trespassing on our community's land," she snapped. "You don't belong here. You never did. That cabin should have been demolished years ago." "Funny," I said quietly, "because I've got a county judge who disagrees." She glared at me, shaking the papers in her hand. "You're going to regret this. You've made enemies in all the wrong places." Then she stepped closer, lowering her voice to a hiss. "You think you're fighting me, but you're fighting people with power. Developers, investors. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Her words hit hard, but not the way she intended, because in that moment I realized something. Peggy wasn't the mastermind. She was just a pawn, a loud, arrogant pawn, but a pawn nonetheless. Someone bigger was pulling the strings. Someone who had a lot more to lose if this land stayed mine. When she left, spinning gravel in her wake, I called Daniel. "She's losing it," I said, but she hinted there's more going on. She mentioned investors. "That tracks," Daniel replied. "Silver Pine Development, LLC has ties to a larger company, Weston Holdings. They're known for pushing shady land deals and flipping properties into luxury subdivisions. If we dig into their financials, we might find proof that your land was illegally reclassified to fit their development scheme. And dig we did. Over the next few days, Daniel's paralegal uncovered a paper trail that connected Weston Holdings to Holt Realty, Peggy's company. The same company that filed the fake quitclaim deed years ago. The signature on the document was almost laughably bad, a scrawl pretending to be my father's. When Daniel showed it to me, I felt my chest tighten. My dad's name had been used to steal the land he'd loved most in the world. We took that evidence straight to the county prosecutor's office. The investigator, a serious woman named Carla Dean, reviewed the files and whistled low. "This is bad," she said. "Forgery, false recording, unauthorized development. This could go criminal real fast." By the weekend, word had started to spread. The local newspaper ran a headline that made my heart skip: "Homeowner fights HOA after land stolen for secret development project." The article laid out everything: how Silver Pine tried to annex my property under false pretenses, how the HOA president had ties to the developer, how I'd uncovered construction already happening on private land. Within hours of publication, my phone started buzzing with messages, neighbors, journalists, even a local news station asking for interviews. Daniel advised me to keep my statement short and factual, but the damage to Peggy's empire was already done. Silver Pine's community forum exploded with comments. Some residents defended Peggy blindly, calling me a troublemaker and squatter, but others started asking real questions. Why didn't we know about Phase 4? Where's our HOA money actually going? Is this even legal? By Monday morning, a group of homeowners had called an emergency board meeting. For the first time, Peggy wasn't in control of the narrative. That same evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, 3 cars pulled up at my driveway. It wasn't law enforcement this time, it was a small group of Silver Pine residents. A man in his 50s introduced himself as Tom Hensley, the HOA's treasurer. "Mr. Carter," he said, "we came to apologize. We didn't know what Peggy was doing. We thought this land was part of the expansion." I nodded cautiously. "She didn't give you the full story, I'm guessing." Tom shook his head. "Not even close. When the paper hit this morning, the board demanded access to the HOA's financials. Turns out she's been using community funds to pay contractors for the illegal construction on your land." My jaw tightened. "So she stole from you too?" Tom sighed. "Looks that way. We're calling for her resignation. And, well, a few of us want to help you however we can. This community's not supposed to be like that." It was the first genuine act of decency I'd seen since this nightmare began. The next day, county investigators served subpoenas to both Peggy and Weston Holdings. The sheriff came by to take my formal statement, this time treating me not as a nuisance, but as a victim. I showed him every document, every recording, every timestamp. He nodded slowly as he took notes. "You did your homework," he said. "If half this checks out, that HOA's in serious trouble." Still, I wasn't celebrating yet, because Peggy hadn't disappeared. In fact, she seemed to grow bolder as the walls closed in. That night, I found a rock thrown through one of my windows. The note attached simply said, "You don't belong here." I repaired the glass, set up more cameras, and refused to back down. The following morning, I got a call from Daniel. His voice carried an edge of triumph. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "The court just scheduled a full hearing. And get this, the county prosecutor's office filed a separate criminal complaint against Holt Realty for document forgery and illegal land annexation." I felt something inside me finally exhale, a weight I'd been carrying since the moment I saw those first red "no trespassing" signs. "So it's happening?" I asked. "It's happening," Daniel said. "And with the evidence we've got, they won't stand a chance." Over the next few days, news vans started showing up near the entrance of Silver Pine Estates. The once pristine neighborhood now buzzed with tension. Some residents waved when they saw me driving by. Others glared, as if blaming me for exposing their quiet little kingdom's corruption. But I didn't care about their stares. For the first time, I wasn't on defense. I was fighting back and winning. Meanwhile, Peggy had gone silent. Her office was closed, her phone disconnected, and her SUV hadn't been seen in days. Rumors spread that she'd fled to another state to avoid charges. But something told me she wasn't gone. Not yet. As I sat on my porch that night, watching the moon rise over the trees my father once planted, I felt both peace and anticipation. The land felt alive again, like it was waiting for justice to settle into its soil. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The court battle was coming, and if I'd learned anything about people like Peggy Holt, it was that they fought hardest when they were cornered. The morning of the court hearing felt like the world had stopped holding its breath. A gray mist hung low over the valley as I drove into town, the tires of my truck crunching against the frostbitten gravel. My old cabin had stood through storms, fires, and years of neglect, but that day, it finally felt like it might be saved. Inside that courthouse, years of deceit, intimidation, and betrayal were about to unravel. The courtroom was small but packed. Reporters filled the benches along the back wall, cameras waiting outside like vultures. On one side sat Daniel and me, surrounded by boxes of evidence, files, maps, and photographs. On the other side, Peggy sat rigidly in a charcoal suit, her face pale, but still somehow defiant. Her lawyer, a man in an expensive gray suit, whispered frantically to her, but she didn't seem to hear him. Behind her sat two representatives from Weston Holdings, the shadowy investors who'd financed this whole operation. When the judge entered, the room quieted. His name was Judge Abernathy, a man with a reputation for patience and precision. He looked over the documents before him, his brow furrowed in that way that said he'd already seen enough nonsense for one morning. "Let's begin," he said simply. Daniel stood first, his voice calm but sharp as glass. "Your Honor, what we have here is not a mere dispute over property boundaries. It's a case of deliberate fraud and coercion. My client, Mr. Carter, is the rightful owner of the cabin and the surrounding land. The opposing party, represented by Ms. Holt and Weston Holdings, knowingly filed forged deeds, illegally reclassified parcels, and constructed developments without consent." He laid out each piece of evidence like a hammer striking a nail: the original title deed, the survey maps, the fake quitclaim document bearing my father's forged signature, the HOA meeting minutes where Peggy approved the expansion plan without community consent. Then came the photographs. Heavy machinery cutting across my property line, construction stakes bearing Weston Holdings logo, and the no trespassing signs nailed into my own trees. The judge studied each one carefully. "And you're asserting," he asked, "that these documents were filed without Mr. Carter's knowledge or approval?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. We've had a forensic handwriting analyst confirm that the signature on the 2019 quitclaim deed is a forgery. Furthermore, the land registry log shows it was filed by an employee of Holt Realty under Ms. Holt's direct supervision." The room fell into a stunned hush. Peggy's lawyer stood quickly, his tone defensive. "Your Honor, my client acted in good faith. The property boundaries were unclear, and the judge held up a hand. Counselor, unclear boundaries do not justify falsified legal documents." Peggy shifted in her seat, her jaw tightening. For the first time, she looked nervous. Then it was her turn to speak. Her lawyer gestured for her to take the stand, and she rose slowly, smoothing her skirt. Her voice trembled slightly at first, then hardened. "This is all a misunderstanding. The community believed the land was abandoned. No one had lived there for years. We assumed it was part of the estate transfer when Silver Pine was expanded. I stood, abandoned. I was paying taxes every single year. I kept that cabin up with my own hands. You posted signs on my land, and you knew it. Mr. Carter," the judge cautioned, but I could see even he understood my anger. Peggy's voice cracked. "We were told the property had been sold by the county due to unpaid taxes." Daniel interjected. "Conveniently, that rumor originated from your own office's internal memo. We've included that in evidence." A ripple of murmurs spread across the courtroom. Peggy looked to her lawyer for help, but his expression said it all. There was no saving this. Then came the final blow. The county prosecutor, Carla Dean, stepped forward to present the criminal complaint. She spoke with the calm confidence of someone holding dynamite wrapped in truth. Your Honor, in addition to Mr. Carter's civil claim, the state has initiated criminal proceedings against Holt Realty and its associates for document forgery, false filing, and conspiracy to commit land fraud. We have phone records, email correspondences, and financial transactions connecting Ms. Holt and Weston Holdings to the scheme. Peggy's face went pale as marble. One of the Weston executives leaned forward, whispering harshly, clearly distancing himself. Already. The judge leaned back, tapping his pen against the bench. This court finds overwhelming evidence that the land in question rightfully belongs to Mr. Carter. The forged quitclaim deed is null and void. All structures and developments encroaching upon Mr. Carter's property are to be removed at the expense of the defendants. Furthermore, given the evidence presented by the county, criminal charges will proceed independently. Judgment for the plaintiff. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through every corner of the room. It was over. Peggy's lawyer slumped back, defeated. She sat motionless, staring at the desk in front of her as if the world had stopped turning. The Weston Holdings men stood up quietly and slipped out the back door before the reporters swarmed them. As Daniel packed up the files, he turned to me with a grin that carried 3 years of exhaustion and vindication. You just got your land back, he said, and then some. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter, freer. A few of the Silver Pine residents were waiting. Tom Hensley, the treasurer, approached with a look of quiet respect. We voted her out, he said simply. The HOA board's been dissolved until we can rebuild it right. I'm sorry for everything that happened. I nodded, not out of triumph, but relief. Just make sure no one ever lets power get that twisted again. When I returned to the cabin that afternoon, the wind moved softly through the pines. The red "No Trespassing" signs were still nailed to the trees, faded and cracked from the sun. I pulled each one down myself, one by one, until the last nail dropped into the dirt. The silence afterward was perfect. A week later, the county contractors arrived to dismantle the half-built structures that had trespassed across my boundary. Watching the bulldozers tear down those stolen walls was oddly satisfying, not because I wanted revenge, but because the land was finally breathing again. As the last truck drove away, I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, staring at the lake below. The reflection of the cabin shimmered in the water, like a ghost of the past finally at peace. That night, I opened my father's old journal, the one I'd found in the cabin when I first came back. On the final page, written in his rough, fading handwriting, were the words, "Land doesn't belong to those who build the biggest fences. It belongs to those who remember it." For the first time in years, I truly understood what he meant. Peggy's trial for fraud would drag on for months, and Weston Holdings would end up paying millions in fines and restitution. But that was background noise compared to the simple truth of what I'd reclaimed, not just my land, but my peace. The cabin stood stronger than ever, the woods around it alive with sound again. Every creak of the porch, every rustle of leaves in the wind, felt like the land welcoming me home. 3 years ago, I'd left this place behind, thinking it would always wait for me. I never imagined I'd have to fight to get it back, but I did. And now, no matter how many developers or HOAs came knocking, one thing was certain. This land would never be theirs again. It was mine, always had been, always would be, and as the sun sank over the lake, painting the water in gold and fire, I whispered the words that had been waiting on my tongue since the day I saw those first red signs, "Welcome home,"